Magnus the Red broke the Emperor's greatest dream. Leman Russ burned an entire world. Both believed they were saving humanity. Both believed they were loyal. Both were wrong. This is not the story of heroes and villains. It is the story of a family destroying itself. The story of two brothers who never truly understood one another. And the story of how the brightest hope of the Imperium was turned into ash. Long before the galaxy burned, before Istvan, before Terra, before Horus revealed his betrayal, there was Prospero, a world unlike any other, a world of scholars, mystics, philosophers, a world where knowledge was treasured above all things. At its center stood Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. To many, Magnus was the most gifted of the Emperor's sons, a giant among giants, a warrior, a scholar, a psyker of unimaginable power. Magnus believed knowledge could save humanity. He believed ignorance was mankind's greatest enemy. He believed the future belonged to those willing to seek the truth, no matter the cost. Those beliefs made him extraordinary. They also made him dangerous, because every great strength carries within it the seed of catastrophe. Magnus spent his life searching for answers, ancient secrets, forgotten truths, hidden paths through reality itself. He looked into places other men feared to approach, and every time he stared into the darkness, something stared back. Far away from Prospero, another brother walked a very different path. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, Primarch of the Space Wolves. Where Magnus sought understanding, Russ trusted instinct. Where Magnus questioned everything, Russ obeyed. Where Magnus studied the mysteries of the warp, Russ treated such things as necessary dangers at best, abominations at worst. The two brothers could fight beside one another, but they could never truly agree. One believed knowledge would save mankind. The other believed knowledge would eventually destroy it, and neither would yield. For years, their rivalry simmered beneath the surface. Neither realized that darker powers were already watching, waiting, patiently moving pieces across a galactic chessboard. Because the destruction of Prospero did not begin with Magnus. It did not begin with Russ. It began with Horus, and with a lie. A lie that would condemn entire legions. A lie that would shatter the Emperor's family forever. At the time, however, neither brother knew what was coming. Magnus continued his search for forbidden truths. Russ continued to serve as the Emperor's executioner. Both remained loyal. Both remained convinced they were right. And somewhere in the darkness beyond reality, fate was preparing to prove them wrong. The first step would take place on a forgotten world called Agoru. A world where Magnus believed he had discovered something that could change humanity forever. A discovery that would ultimately destroy everything. Agoru was a dead world. A wasteland of dust, salt flats, endless winds. To most Imperial commanders, it was worthless. To Magnus the Red, it was a treasure. For centuries, strange stories had surrounded the planet. The native tribes spoke of a place called the Mountain that Eats Men. a colossal artificial structure that rose from the barren landscape like a scar upon the world. Travelers entered, few returned. Those who did spoke of strange visions, whispers, dreams. Magnus was intrigued, because he sensed something beneath the mountain, something ancient, something powerful, and perhaps something that could help humanity. The Crimson King had become obsessed with a single idea: distance. The Imperium stretched across an entire galaxy. Messages took weeks, sometimes months. Armies were delayed. Worlds were isolated. Humanity was united in theory, but not in practice. Magnus believed there had to be a better way, and on Agoru, he thought he had found it. Deep beneath the mountain, hidden from ordinary sight, he sensed traces of an ancient network, a pathway, a gateway, a road through reality itself. The Webway. If humanity could master it, everything would change. Travel across the stars would become instantaneous. Communication would become effortless. The Imperium would become truly united. To Magnus, this was not merely a discovery. It was salvation. And so he searched. While his sons explored the ruins, Magnus descended deeper and deeper into the mysteries below. Among those assisting him was Azek Ahriman, chief librarian of the Thousand Sons, perhaps the finest mortal psyker in the Imperium. Ahriman trusted his Primarch completely. Most of the Legion did. Magnus was more than their ruler. He was their protector, their teacher, their father. Because the Thousand Sons carried a terrible curse. The flesh change. A mutation hidden within their gene seed. A sickness that could transform even the greatest warrior into a mindless monster. Magnus had saved them once before, through knowledge, through power, through sacrifice. And because of that, his sons followed him without question. Unfortunately, not everyone shared their faith. One day, the sky above Agoru darkened. Thunder rolled across the desert. Ships descended from orbit. Not enemies, not invaders, brothers. The space wolves had arrived. Their leader was not Leman Russ, but his message was clear. Amlodi Skarsen Skarsenson, Lord of the Fifth Company, warrior of Fenris. He arrived with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. No diplomacy, no ceremony, no patience. Only a demand. Leman Russ required Magnus elsewhere, immediately. The atmosphere changed at once. The Thousand Sons disliked the wolves. The wolves disliked the Thousand Sons. Neither side made much effort to hide it. Years of suspicion sat between them, years of distrust. To the Thousand Sons, the Space Wolves were barbarians. To the Space Wolves, the Thousand Sons were sorcerers pretending to be scholars. The tension was obvious, and it was growing worse. Because while Magnus searched for answers beneath the mountain, events elsewhere in the Imperium were already moving toward a far greater conflict. A conflict that would soon erupt at Nikaea, a place where the future of every psyker in the Imperium would be decided. A place where Magnus would make powerful enemies, and where his fate would begin to unravel. The Council of Nikaea was supposed to settle a debate. Instead, it changed the fate of the Imperium. For years, the use of psychic powers had divided the legions. Some saw them as humanity's greatest weapon. Others saw them as the first step toward damnation. No legion stood closer to the center of that argument than the Thousand Sons. And no Primarch defended psychic power more passionately than Magnus the Red. When the Emperor summoned his sons to Nikaea, the entire Imperium paid attention. Primarchs, generals, governors, scholars, warriors, all gathered to witness a decision that would shape humanity's future. Magnus arrived confident, perhaps too confident. He believed logic would prevail. He believed knowledge would win. Most importantly, he believed the Emperor would understand. After all, Magnus had always viewed psychic power as a gift, a tool, a force that could elevate mankind to heights never before imagined. He did not see himself as dangerous. He saw himself as necessary. But Magnus was not the only one prepared to speak. His enemies had come as well. Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, a man who hated psykers with every fiber of his being. To Mortarion, sorcery was poison, a corruption that could only lead to disaster. And then there was Leman Russ, the Wolf King. Russ never trusted Magnus, never trusted the Thousand Sons, and certainly never trusted men who believed they could control powers beyond their understanding. One by one, accusations filled the council chambers. The Thousand Sons were called reckless, arrogant, dangerous. Some even called them warlocks. Magnus answered every charge. His arguments were brilliant, his knowledge unmatched. He spoke of enlightenment, progress, the future of humanity. For a moment, it seemed possible that he might win. But Magnus failed to understand something. The trial had never truly been about facts. It was about fear. And fear is difficult to defeat. The Imperium feared the warp, feared possession, feared corruption, feared powers it could not fully understand. And Magnus had become the face of those fears. When the Emperor finally spoke, the chamber fell silent. Every warrior, every Primarch, every mortal waited for judgment. The verdict was absolute. The Librarius program would be dissolved. The study of sorcery would end. Psychic experimentation would cease. The Edict of Nikaea had been declared. Magnus stood frozen. For the first time in years, he had no answer, no argument, no defense. The Emperor had spoken, and the Emperor had rejected everything he believed. The Thousand Sons returned to Prospero in silence. Their victory had become defeat. Their future had become uncertain. And Magnus retreated deeper into his studies than ever before. because although he accepted the emperor's judgment publicly, he could not bring himself to believe it was right. That decision would cost him everything. Because while Magnus searched for answers on Prospero, far across the galaxy, Horus was falling. And soon, Magnus would witness the beginning of a nightmare he would desperately try to stop, only to become the instrument of its success. Magnus saw the future, and the future terrified him. After Nikaea, he withdrew from the public eye. Many believed he was obeying the emperor's decree. They were wrong. Magnus had stopped speaking. He had not stopped searching. The Crimson King spent countless hours exploring the depths of the great ocean. The warp, a realm of impossible truths, a realm where time itself meant little. There, among shifting currents of energy and thought, Magnus witnessed something horrifying. Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's favored son, corrupted, broken, falling into darkness. At first, Magnus refused to believe it. Horus was loyal. Horus was the greatest of the Primarchs. Horus was the man who would one day lead humanity into its golden age. Yet the visions continued, again and again, each worse than the last. Magnus saw betrayal, civil war, legions turning upon one another, worlds burning, the Imperium collapsing into chaos. And at the center of it all stood Horus. The future was changing, and not for the better. Magnus knew he had to act. The problem was simple. No ordinary message could reach Terra in time. Astropathic communication was too slow. Warp travel was too uncertain. By the time the warning arrived, it would be too late. So Magnus made a decision, one that would define the rest of his life. He would break the Emperor's command. He would use his powers one final time. Not for himself, not for knowledge, not for glory, but to save humanity. The ritual began deep beneath Prospero. Thousands of thralls gathered. Psychic amplifiers were prepared. Ancient wards ignited with blue fire. The entire planet seemed to tremble. Even Ahriman felt uneasy. The scale of the ritual was beyond anything the Legion had attempted before. Yet Magnus pressed forward, because he believed the stakes justified the risk. He believed he was doing the right thing. That belief would become his greatest mistake. As the ritual reached its peak, Magnus cast his consciousness into the warp. His body remained on Prospero, but his spirit soared across the galaxy, through storms, through nightmares, through dimensions that mortal minds were never meant to witness. He raced toward Terra, toward the Imperial Palace, toward the Emperor. And then he encountered something unexpected. A barrier, an immense psychic wall surrounding the palace, far stronger than anything Magnus had imagined. It blocked his path completely. For the first time, doubt entered his mind. The Emperor had hidden something. Something enormous. Something important. Magnus could have turned back. He could have accepted failure. He could have searched for another way. Instead, he chose to force his way through. And at that moment, something in the warp noticed him. Something ancient. Something patient. Something that had been watching him for years. A voice offered assistance, power, strength, a way through the barrier. Magnus knew he should refuse. He knew the danger. Yet Terra had to be warned. Humanity had to be saved. And so, the Crimson King accepted help from a force he did not fully understand. The consequences would be catastrophic, because in trying to save the Imperium, Magnus was about to destroy the Emperor's greatest secret. The Emperor never saw Magnus arrive, not at first. The barrier surrounding Terra was unlike anything the Primarch had ever encountered. It was not merely a psychic shield, it was a fortress, a masterpiece, a structure built to protect something of unimaginable importance. Yet Magnus had come too far to turn back. Horus was falling. The Imperium was in danger. Time was running out. So he struck. The force of his psychic assault shook reality itself. The barrier cracked, then shattered. Magnus burst through, and instantly realized something was wrong. Very wrong. Beneath the Imperial Palace lay a vast network of impossible machinery. Ancient mechanisms, golden pathways. A project so immense that even Magnus struggled to comprehend its scale. The Webway, the Emperor's secret. For years, while the Great Crusade raged across the galaxy, the Emperor had been working toward a single goal: humanity's liberation from dependence on the warp. A future where mankind could travel between worlds without exposing itself to demons and corruption. A future safe from chaos. Magnus destroyed it in seconds. His warning reached Terra, but so did the devastation. Psychic fire erupted through the hidden tunnels beneath the palace. Protective wards collapsed. Ancient machines failed. Reality tore open. The Webway flooded with horrors from the warp. Thousands died instantly. Thousands more were driven mad. The damage was catastrophic. And at the center of it all stood Magnus, frozen, horrified, unable to comprehend what he had done. The Emperor appeared before him. For one brief moment, father and son looked at one another. Magnus expected gratitude. He expected urgency, perhaps even forgiveness. Instead, he saw disappointment. No, something worse. The Emperor looked at him with absolute devastation. The kind of devastation reserved for someone you once trusted completely. Only then did Magnus understand. His warning had arrived, but the cost had been unbearable. Everything the Emperor had been building in secret, everything he had sacrificed for, had been shattered by his own son. Magnus tried to explain, tried to speak, tried to warn his father about Horus. The words no longer mattered. The damage had already been done. Moments later, his spirit was violently thrown back across the galaxy. back to Prospero, back to his body, back to the nightmare he had created. When Magnus opened his eyes, he already knew the truth. There would be consequences. The Emperor would not ignore what had happened. A punishment was coming. And for the first time in his life, Magnus was afraid. Meanwhile, far away on Davin, Horus received news of what had happened. The War Master smiled, because Magnus had just done exactly what chaos needed him to do. The Emperor was trapped. The Webway Project was ruined. And now the Imperium's greatest defender would be forced to deal with his wayward son. The next move was obvious. Prospero had to fall. All that remained was choosing the executioner. And Horus knew exactly which brother to send. The Emperor did not order Magnus to be killed. That was never the plan. Despite everything that had happened, despite the destruction of the Webway Project, despite the unimaginable damage Magnus had caused, the Emperor still wanted his son brought back alive. Magnus would answer for his crimes, but he would answer in chains, not in a grave. That order was entrusted to Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the Emperor's executioner. There were few men in the galaxy better suited for the task. Russ had spent his entire life doing the jobs nobody else wanted. When monsters had to be slain, the wolves were sent. When worlds had to be broken, the wolves were sent. When the Emperor required absolute obedience, he called upon Russ. And now he called again. At least, that was how it should have happened, because somewhere between Terra and Fenris, the order changed. Horus saw to that. The War Master understood something important. If Magnus survived, he might reveal the truth. If Magnus survived, he might expose Horus's treachery. If Magnus survived, the heresy could die before it truly began. So Horus intervened, quietly, carefully. A suggestion here, a warning there, a few carefully chosen words, nothing more. Yet it was enough. By the time the message reached Russ, it no longer sounded like an arrest. It sounded like a sentence. The Wolf King accepted the mission, but even then, he hesitated. Because despite their rivalry, despite years of arguments, despite all his distrust, Magnus was still his brother. Russ had fought beside him, bled beside him, laughed beside him. The idea of destroying an entire legion was not one he embraced lightly. Unfortunately, events on Prospero were making peace impossible. Magnus had seen the future. He knew punishment was coming. He knew the wolves were on their way. And he did something no one expected. Nothing. No defenses were prepared, no fleets deployed, no counterattack planned. The orbital defenses remained silent. The warning systems were ignored. The Thousand Sons were told nothing. Ahriman could not understand it. The Legion could not understand it. Even Magnus's closest advisors were confused. Why weren't they preparing for war? Why weren't they fighting? The answer was simple. Magnus believed he deserved punishment. He believed he had failed. Failed the Emperor. Failed humanity. Failed his sons. For the first time in his life, the Crimson King had lost faith in himself. And so he waited. Meanwhile, the Space Wolves' fleet crossed the stars. Thousands of warriors, hundreds of warships, enough firepower to annihilate a world. Beside them traveled another force, the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's witch hunters, women whose very presence suffocated psychic power, women uniquely suited to fight the Thousand Suns. Together they advanced toward Prospero, toward Tizca, toward destiny. Neither side fully understood what was happening. Neither side realized they were being manipulated. Both believed they were acting out of loyalty, and that was the cruelest part of all, because this was never a war between traitors and heroes. It was a war between two loyal sons, a war designed by Horus, a war that chaos had wanted from the very beginning. And soon, Prospero would burn. Prospero never fired a shot. Not at first. As the Space Wolves' fleet entered the system, the planet remained silent. No defense fleets emerged. No orbital weapons activated. No warnings were transmitted. The Wolves expected resistance. They found nothing. Leman Russ could hardly believe it. An entire legion stood before him. A legion of powerful psychers. A legion capable of tearing ships from the sky. Yet Prospero remained quiet. The silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Still, the fleet advanced, and eventually, the order was given. The bombardment began. Fire rained from the heavens. Orbital batteries unleashed destruction upon Tizca, the city of light, the jewel of Prospero, the greatest center of learning in the Imperium. Ancient libraries exploded into flames. Crystal towers shattered. Entire districts vanished beneath waves of fire. Thousands died within minutes. Many never even understood why. On the surface, panic spread rapidly. The Thousand Suns were stunned. No declaration, no negotiation, no warning, only destruction. Ahriman watched the sky burn. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. Surely the wolves would stop. Surely someone would explain. But the bombardment continued, and with every passing minute, more of Prospero died. The Legion demanded answers. They turned to Magnus, their father, their Primarch, their king. And finally, Magnus spoke. The truth shocked them. He had known. He had known punishment was coming. He had known the wolves were approaching. And he had chosen to do nothing. The revelation spread through the Legion like poison. Many were furious, others heartbroken. Some simply refused to believe it. Yet the evidence stood before them. Their world was burning because Magnus had allowed it. Ahriman could barely contain his anger. For years they had followed Magnus without question. For years they had trusted his wisdom. Now everything they loved was dying around them, and their Primarch had surrendered without a fight. The bombardment ended, only because a second phase had begun. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere. Thunderhawks descended through smoke and ash. The Space Wolves had arrived. The invasion of Prospero had begun. Across the shattered city, warriors prepared for battle. Not because Magnus commanded it, because survival demanded it. The Thousand Sons took up arms. The wolves advanced through burning streets, and the dream of reconciliation died forever. The war for Prospero had begun. Before it ended, entire legions would be broken, and brothers who had once fought side by side would drown the city in blood. The streets of Tizca became a battlefield. Every avenue, every plaza, every shattered library. War erupted across the city. The Space Wolves pushed forward relentlessly. Bolters roared, chainswords screamed. Buildings collapsed around them. But the Thousand Sons were far from helpless. For years, the Imperium had feared their powers. Now those fears became reality. Lightning erupted from open hands. Psychic fire consumed entire squads. Invisible force shattered ceramide armor. The wolves paid for every meter of ground with blood. Yet they kept advancing. Because they were space wolves, and because Russ had come to finish the job. The fighting grew increasingly desperate. Neither side understood the full truth. Neither side knew Horus had manipulated them both. Each believed the other had chosen this war, and so the slaughter continued. Then something even worse happened. Something the Thousand Sons feared more than death. The flesh change returned. The ancient curse that had haunted the Legion for generations. The sickness Magnus had held back for years. The chaos of battle weakened the barriers keeping it contained. One warrior after another began to mutate. Bones twisted, armor split apart, bodies expanded into monstrous shapes. The Thousand Sons suddenly found themselves fighting two enemies, the wolves and themselves. One of the victims was Hestar, a powerful warrior, a loyal son of Magnus, a brother respected throughout the Legion. Ahriman watched in horror as the transformation began. He tried to help, tried to stop it, tried to save him. Nothing worked. The flesh change consumed Hestar completely. Within moments, the warrior was gone. A monster stood in his place. A nightmare of claws, flesh, and madness. The creature lashed out at friend and foe alike. Everything around it died. Then another figure appeared through the smoke. Leman Russ, the Wolf King. The giant moved without hesitation. No speech, no warning, no mercy. His weapon rose. A single shot echoed through the battlefield. Hestar collapsed. The monster was dead. For a brief moment, silence followed. Not because the battle had stopped, but because everyone understood what that moment meant. The curse was real. The Thousand Sons were losing control, and the city was falling. As Tizca burned around them, one terrible truth became impossible to ignore. This war could no longer be stopped, only survived. And somewhere within the ruins, two brothers were finally moving toward each other. Magnus and Russ. The confrontation that would decide the fate of Prospero was drawing near. Magnus had never wanted this war. Not truly. For all his pride, for all his mistakes, for all his arrogance, he had never wanted to fight his brother. Yet as Tizca burned around him, the truth became impossible to ignore. There was no peace left to save, no negotiation left to attempt, no future left to preserve. Prospero was dying, and with it, everything Magnus had spent his life building. The libraries were gone, the academies were gone. The towers of knowledge that had stood for centuries were collapsing into fire and ash. His sons were dying. His world was dying. And still, the wolves advanced. At last, the Crimson King moved. The skies darkened. Psychic energy rolled across the battlefield like a storm. Thousands of warriors paused. Even the space wolves felt it. Something immense had awakened. Magnus the Red had entered the war. The Primarch strode through the ruins of Tizca like a god from ancient myth. Bolter fire struck him and vanished. Explosions erupted around him. None of it mattered. The warp itself seemed to bend around his presence. Across the city, Leman Russ felt it, and smiled. The Wolf King had not crossed the galaxy to fight soldiers. He had come for Magnus. Nothing else mattered. The battlefield began to empty around them, not because the fighting stopped, because everyone instinctively understood what was about to happen. This was no longer a war between legions. It was a war between Primarchs. The two brothers finally stood face to face. For a brief moment, neither moved. Years of history stood between them. Years of arguments, years of rivalry, years of resentment. Magnus looked at Russ and saw a weapon. A creature created to destroy whatever the Emperor pointed at. Russ looked at Magnus and saw exactly what he had always feared. A man who believed his own wisdom placed him above all limits. Neither entirely wrong, neither entirely right. The first blow came like thunder. Russ attacked with terrifying speed. Magnus answered with psychic force. The city shook. Buildings collapsed. The air itself seemed to tear apart. Every strike carried enough power to kill ordinary warriors by the thousands. Yet neither brother yielded. Magnus cut through Russ's armor with blasts of psychic energy. Russ answered with frostblade strikes capable of splitting tanks in half. Again and again and again. The duel raged through the burning city. Both warriors bleeding, both exhausted, both refusing to surrender. But one truth slowly became clear. Magnus was fighting with doubt. Russ was not. And doubt is fatal in war. The Wolf King saw his opening and took it. Russ crashed into Magnus with the force of an avalanche. The two Primarchs slammed into the shattered ruins of Tizca. Stone exploded, steel twisted. Ancient monuments collapsed around them. Still, they fought. Magnus unleashed everything he possessed. Lightning, fire, psychic force powerful enough to tear reality apart. For a moment it seemed enough. For a moment it seemed the Crimson King might actually win. Russ staggered. His armor split open. Blood ran from deep wounds. The Wolf King roared in pain. Yet he kept coming, because pain meant nothing to Leman Russ. Only victory mattered. The duel reached its climax. One final exchange. One final mistake. Magnus hesitated. Russ did not. The Wolf King seized his brother, lifted him from the ground, and with a terrible crack, broke him. The sound echoed across the battlefield. Every Thousand Suns warrior heard it. Every space wolf heard it. The Crimson King's spine shattered. The greatest psyker in the Imperium collapsed. And with him, Prospero died. Across the city, resistance crumbled. The surviving Thousand Suns felt their hope vanish. Their Primarch had fallen. Their world was lost. Yet Magnus refused to let his sons perish. Broken, defeated, dying. He reached into the warp one final time and made a choice. A desperate choice. A terrible choice. A choice that would save his legion. At a terrible price. Reality split apart. The surviving Thousand Suns vanished from Prospero, drawn into the warp, carried to a distant sanctuary. The planet of the Sorcerers, a world that would become both their refuge and their prison. When the light faded, the battle was over. Prospero burned. The libraries were gone. The towers were gone. The dream was gone. Only ruins remained. Russ stood among the ashes, victorious. Yet there was no triumph, no celebration, no glory. Because somewhere deep inside, even the Wolf King understood the truth. Something was wrong. This had never felt like justice. This had never felt like victory. Too much had been lost. Too much had been destroyed. And far away, aboard his flagship, Horus smiled. The trap had worked perfectly. Two loyal legions had shattered one another. One Primarch had fallen. Another had been broken. And the Imperium was weaker than ever. Exactly as chaos intended. The tragedy of Prospero did not end when the guns fell silent. In many ways, it was only beginning. The survivors of the Thousand Suns found themselves stranded upon the planet of the Sorcerers, a world deep within the Eye of Terror, a world where reality itself obeyed different rules. There, beneath impossible skies and among towers of black stone, the legions struggled to survive. Many blamed Russ. Many blamed the Emperor. Some blamed Horus. But Ahriman blamed himself. He had witnessed the destruction of his world, the deaths of his brothers, the fall of his Primarch. And one terrifying truth haunted him above all others. The flesh change was returning. The curse had survived. Prospero had changed nothing. The Legion was still dying, slowly, inevitably. Ahriman became obsessed, just as Magnus once had. He searched for answers, for solutions, for forbidden knowledge. The cycle was beginning again. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the truth slowly emerged. The Emperor had never ordered Magnus's execution. Horus had manipulated events. Messages had been twisted. Intentions had been corrupted. Loyal sons had been turned against one another. The realization came too late. Prospero was already gone. The 1,000 sons were already exiled. The Horus Heresy was already underway, and the galaxy was already burning. So who was guilty? Magnus? Perhaps. He broke the Emperor's command. He trusted powers he did not fully understand. He believed his wisdom could overcome any danger. And that arrogance destroyed everything. But Russ was not innocent either. He allowed anger to guide him. He accepted destruction when restraint was still possible. He became the weapon Horus needed. Neither brother was a villain. Neither brother was entirely right. That is what makes Prospero such a tragedy. 2 loyal sons, 2 loyal legions, both trying to save the Imperium, both convinced they were doing the right thing, and both helping destroy the very future they hoped to protect. That was the true victory of chaos, not the burning of a city, not the fall of a legion, but the destruction of trust. The moment the Emperor's family turned against itself, the moment brother raised his hand against brother. And from that moment forward, the galaxy was doomed. Prospero became ash. Magnus became an exile. Russ became an executioner haunted by his own victory. And the dream of a united humanity began to die. The Horus Heresy would rage on. Worlds would burn. Primarchs would fall. Terra itself would be besieged. But for many, the true beginning of the end was here. On a world of scholars and dreamers, a world consumed by fire, a world called Prospero. Prospero was gone, but its ghosts remained. The fires eventually died. The bombardment ended. The screams faded. Yet the consequences of that day would echo across the galaxy for 10,000 years. Far from the ruins of Tizca, the survivors of the 1,000 Suns gathered upon the planet of the Sorcerers, a world unlike any other. A world where reality bent beneath the weight of the warp. A world where impossible towers pierced impossible skies. It was here that Magnus brought his broken legion, not as conquerors, not as scholars, but as refugees. For the first time since their creation, the 1,000 Suns had no home, no empire, no future, only questions. Many blamed Russ, many blamed the Emperor, many blamed Horus. But Azek Ahriman blamed something else. Fate. Because no matter what they had done, everything had led here. The flesh change still haunted the Legion. The curse still lurked within their gene seed. Prospero had burned, thousands had died, and still the nightmare remained. Ahriman became obsessed, just as Magnus once had. There had to be a solution. There had to be a way to save his brothers, no matter the cost. It was a belief that would one day create an even greater tragedy. The rubric. But that nightmare belonged to another age. For now, another reckoning was taking place. Othere Weirdmake, the rune priest who had stood against Magnus, the warrior who had helped condemn Prospero. At last he learned the truth about Horus, the truth about the manipulation, the truth about the lies. And for the first time, certainty abandoned him. Everything he believed had been used. Everything he trusted had been twisted. Everything he thought was righteous had helped destroy an entire world. Ahriman offered him no mercy, no forgiveness, no understanding. Only truth, the cruelest weapon of all. When Weirdmake finally understood the scale of the disaster, despair consumed him. Because the tragedy of Prospero was not that one side was evil. It was that both sides had been loyal. Both sides had fought for what they believed was right. Both sides had been deceived. And both sides had lost. Magnus lost his world. Russ lost his certainty. The Emperor lost a son. And humanity lost its future. That was the true victory of chaos. Not corruption, not possession, not demons. Division, the destruction of trust. The moment the Emperor's family turned upon itself, everything that followed began here. The Drop Site Massacre, the Shadow Crusade, the Siege of Terra, the death of Sanguinius, the fall of Horus. All of it traces back to this moment, to a warning delivered too late, to a king who believed knowledge could save everyone, to a wolf who believed obedience would save the Imperium, and to a lie whispered by the War Master. Even now, 10,000 years later, the question remains. Was Magnus a hero who tried to save humanity? Or a fool whose arrogance doomed it? Was Russ a loyal son carrying out his duty? Or the executioner who destroyed the wrong enemy? The answer depends on who tells the story. Perhaps that is why the tragedy of Prospero endures, because there was never a villain, only brothers. Brothers who failed one another, brothers who loved the same father, brothers who believed they were saving the future, and in doing so, helped set the galaxy on fire. The wolves still howl, the sorcerers still remember, and the ashes of Prospero still drift through history. A warning, a lesson, and one of the greatest tragedies in the entire Horus Heresy.